Usually with talks on parapsychology, it'll be focused on something really broad, but today I want to talk to you about one particular man. But I'll take you through my background and what I'm involved with. Hands up, how many people here are familiar with parapsychology? Just a few of you. Okay. Well, I'm based at the University of Northampton. I'm qualified as a psychologist, but I specialise in parapsychology. We have a third-year taught module in the psychology course, which means that anyone that's gone through a psychology degree, they can pick this module to study, and it's basically exploring human abilities and experiences that appear to be outside of the realms of current scientific understanding. So that could involve things such as ESP, that could involve telepathy, mind-to-mind interaction, clairvoyance, the ability to see information at distance, precognition, seeing information before it happens. So those are encapsulated within the term ESP. We're also interested in psychokinesis, the ability to affect people or the environment via the power of the mind alone. So this could go in different ways. I mean, I'm sure from a nod of heads you're all familiar with spoon bending and Uragella. Yeah. So it could be influencing metal, items, or even people as well. You have that whole people as well. So this is where the whole story of the men who stare at goats come from as well. It's kind of developed on that. There were early lab studies with the medium Nina Kalagana, and she was asked at one point if she could influence frogs' heart rates. And during those studies, she was capable of stopping some of the frogs' hearts. So this developed into the storyline for training soldiers for warfare to see if they could stop the opponents by affecting their heart rates or influencing their bodies. This research has such a vast history to it as well. And parapsychology also looks at survival. So we have ESP, PK, psychokinesis, and survival. And within survival, we're interested in any experiences that suggest survival of the mind outside of the body, such as in out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences, through to survival beyond bodily death. So can the mind operate beyond bodily death? Examples of that might be mediumship, reincarnation, some examples of recording anomalous voices on cassette tapes or hearing someone on the telephone that's died, through to apparitions, ghosts and hauntings, which will be the topic of today, with some out-of-body experiences mixed in. How many of you are familiar with Alex Tanous, out of interest? How many of you are familiar with Alex Tanous, the gentleman who's on the book? So,
I've only just bought the book.
You've only just bought the book. So none of you had heard about him before that. Well, he was kind of mainly famous in the USA, and I was just surprised with how long he was about in parapsychology, that he didn't build such a big presence here in the UK that he did in the USA. He became a worldwide lecturer on well-being, spirituality, and some topics of parapsychology as well. He was born in 1926 in Van Buren, Maine, moved to Portland later, but before he was born, his father was good friends with the author Khalil Gibran, who was the author of The Prophet. And I see a few nods of head, so some of you are familiar with that. So Alex's father was working in New York. He was friends with Khalil Gibran, and Khalil Gibran came forward and he said, "You will have a son, a man of great gifts, but also a man of great sorrows." And so Alex's father and mother had a background in psychic phenomena. They're both given psychic readings to people, and they took this as some sort of sign that Alex will be special, he will be gifted just like them, but maybe his gift might be heightened. So Alex was born, and there was a few signs that came about instantly that there was something different about him. Firstly, he was born with the veil. In certain cultures, they take this as a sign that the child is psychically gifted. The afterbirth is draped over the child's head, and this is what Alex had. He also had, in the palm of one of his hands, the Star of David in the creases in his handprint. For some, this has been a sign of psychic phenomena as well, being prominent within the child. There's a few noted psychics whose names I can't remember right now, but they had this as well. And in Alex's other palm, he had an inverted A as well. They wanted to call him Alexander, and this was a sign that they should go ahead and give him that name. So straight away they had these instant signs from Khalil Gibran, potentially that Alex was going to be psychically gifted. And then more and more things started to come about. They realised that when he could actually start to crawl, he would start to pick out things within the living room, but they wouldn't know how he was doing it. One example was there was a record that they played to him that was full of nursery rhymes, and his favourite nursery rhyme on there was "Mary Had a Little Lamb." and they'd have a stack of records, and you've all seen record covers, the cardboard cover. Usually there's no difference in the grain or texture to these things, but he'd crawl over, run his finger down all the records, and he'd always pick the one that was just the nursery rhymes with Mary Had a Little Lamb on it. And they thought, well, how's he doing that? So they'd take the record and put it in different levels, and still he would crawl over, run his finger down, and when he got to the particular record, he'd pull it out. They had no idea how he was doing this. He'd also start to look at and speak to imaginary friends. But when his family said, well, who are you talking to? He would describe people, their features, their clothing, that appeared to match deceased family members and friends. So they were really quite shocked that he was saying that he was interacting with these people. And I've mentioned this touch. This is kind of like psychometry, with the idea that he's touching things and he's getting an image in his mind. He's reading this information by touching it. There was one time a family friend came over, a friend of Alex's father, and Alex had been taught his manners. He instantly went up to shake the gentleman's hand, and he had this flash, this vision before his mind. And being 5 or 6, he said to the man straight away, "Sir, are you prepared to die?" And Alex's father took him to one side and said, you can't just say that to people. What do you mean by this? And he said, "I'm sorry, Father. This is something that just came to my mind straight away." And he said, "Look, I appreciate they're just popping into your head, but sometimes you've got to keep some things in your head. You can't just say these things to people." The gentleman just shrugged it off. He laughed about it, thought Alex is young. These are just childish things he's coming out with. 24 hours later, the guy did indeed die of a heart attack. When Alex was growing up, he'd have these kind of visions quite regularly, so much so many people in the local area would ask him for certain readings and say, what's going to happen? Is my son going to come back from war okay? That was one particular instance. A lady said, "My son's fighting in the war, will he come back, will he survive?" And he said, "Yes, he will survive, he'll be absolutely fine. In fact, when he does come back, don't let him drive anywhere. Certainly not within the first 2 or 3 days of him getting back. Don't let him cross any railway lines." The son came back from war, he was absolutely fine, didn't need to go back to war, completely uninjured, but within a day or so he did actually take a car out driving, he did cross some railway lines and was hit by the train. So Alex had given that warning, it came true. The interesting thing about precognition is if you don't let people go ahead and do those sorts of things, even though it has led to their demise, it's not actually proven the precognition event. So that's another lecture for another time. So Alex had these troubles. He was psychically gifted, so it seemed, and throughout his schooling it got him in trouble quite a lot. Usually the teacher would be writing a maths equation on the board, and before they completed it, he would blurt out the answer. So he'd forever get in trouble. Again, the teachers would say, "Keep it to yourself." And he was taught in a very religious environment, so there was a lot of teachers that really didn't want him actually speaking of these things. They thought it was very demonic what he was actually coming out with. And there were some that encouraged it, though, because there was some scripture that talked about psychic healing. I mean, one example is the instance where Jesus was walking through a crowd and certain people had touched his gown and felt this instant healing from this figure. So Alex could relate some of his abilities and experiences to biblical interpretation, and that was where his schooling went. He went through very, very heavy schooling in theology, which led him through to philosophy. I have to fast forward in his life for you, though, here at this point. He'd had numerous psychic experiences, as I mentioned. Just one more was he was out selling newspapers with his brother. And he was the oldest of 9. I've got a picture here to show you. So that's his entire family here, if we can get that on camera. All brothers, oldest of 9, and Alex is right here at the top. And he was out with one of his brothers selling newspapers when he instantly got this vision that said to him, "We've got to go home, something's happened to Father." So they stopped selling the newspapers, they rushed home. Lo and behold, their father had actually had an accident. He was planting bamboo canes to grow runner beans, and one of them had snapped and gone through his eye. Hadn't killed him, but 2 weeks later it led to a brain hemorrhage and their father died. So Alex was having these visions quite regularly, and did national service, but then went back to school. And he was well decorated for someone claiming psychic abilities. He had an undergraduate degree in government and politics. He gained a master's degree in theology, a master's degree in philosophy, a master's degree in education and counselling, and a doctorate of divinity as well. So this guy, heavily decorated, and he really wanted to start to get to grips with parapsychology. I mentioned all these different areas we had: ESP, PK, and survival. Alex was interested in survival. He'd had these early images of these childhood friends that turned out to be family friends and close loved ones that have passed away. So he wanted to know, do people regularly have these experiences who aren't psychic? How often do people actually see apparitions of the dead? And he thought the best way to go about doing this, learn more, would be to work in the hospitals. So he started working in the hospitals with the terminally ill. But admittedly, that taught him nothing. He didn't learn anything new. He didn't have any psychic experiences related to the dying. But he met a man who was doing some research at the time, a guy called Dr Karlis Osis. I've got some pictures here to show you again. By the way, this is Alex Tanous. For those of you that haven't seen him, the camera's just got him there. Yeah. Back over there, there's Alex Tanous, how he looked. And Dr Karlis Osis was based at the American Society for Psychical Research. How many of you, siren going, how many of you are familiar with the British Society? We've got it here in London. Excellent. Yep, we have the British Society for Psychical Research. It's been going since 1882. It was founded in Trinity College, Cambridge, and its base is here in London, but the base for the American branch is in New York City. Alex met up with Dr Karlis Osis, who was doing a survey at the time. While Alex was working in the hospitals, he was doing a survey of physicians and nurses that were encountering apparitions around the deathbed. And they realised how popular this was. So for anyone working in end-of-life care, there was a lot of nurses and care staff that were noting the next person that was about to die. It was very common for them to actually see a black figure or mask behind that particular individual. Or when that person died, they might see a mist coming out of their head and then leaving the room or dispersing in the atmosphere. Or even after the patient had been dead for several days, some nursing staff who didn't know that patient had passed away, they were seeing this person's apparition and interacting with them, telling them to go back to bed, I'll bring you a drink, and going there and the bed was empty. Later finding out from staff that indeed that person had died. So how did they just have that experience not knowing that person had died? These things are very, very common. And Karlis Osis was building a study at the time on this, which later turned into a book called At the Hour of Death. So Karlis realised that he got something here with Alex Tanous. But the one thing that really fascinated Karlis was, amongst all those childhood abilities that Alex had, he was capable of going outside of his body whenever he... Please tell me some of you did this, because I used to do this. I used to go up the stairs and put pillows at the bottom, and you just see how high you could get up the stairs and jump off onto the pillows to cushion your landing, and seeing how further up the steps. Did any of you do that? God, I'm really weird, aren't I? But Alex did it as well, so we're just as weird as each other. But he was doing this to cushion his landing. And then one of the jumps, he didn't hurt himself, he was having fun, he was in that state of flow, he was really enjoying himself, time was flying as he was having fun, and he jumped down and he looked back up the stairs, and at the top of the stairs was a vision of himself, looking down and smiling at him. Alex realised that standing at the bottom of the stairs, he could see this vision at the top, but he could also see the view of himself looking down as well. He could see the perspective of the other version of him. He later realised this was his bilocation, or his astral body, or his consciousness outside of the body, that he could use whenever he wanted to actually travel. You might be more familiar with this with the idea of remote viewing, and when people are remote viewing a location, potentially something in their mind has left to travel there. So Alex realised he could do this at will. He could leave the body, travel to places, see what was going on, and then tell people what was going on. Provide some veridical information, not just generic, I saw you having a cup of tea with someone, but I saw you reading something, and there was some sort of code or number, 37196, something specific. And Alex was regularly doing this. And people would report his bilocations. One of the most classic examples was Alex was working in New York City at the American Society for Psychical Research. He was asleep in their quarters, ready to do some studies the next day. That very night Alex was asleep there. In Canada, one of his friends awoke to the sound of the doorbell ringing. He went down to answer it. His wife had woken up as well, and she said, I'll just stay here. And he said, don't worry, I'll go and answer the door. He went down and Alex was there, and Alex said, oh, I'm so sorry for waking you up. I'm really sorry, I was just in the area. I thought I'd catch up with you, just wanted to see how you were doing. And he said, Alex, don't worry, come in, I'll make you a cup of tea. So the guy went in, made Alex a cup of tea, they sat down, they drank tea, and then it was time for Alex to leave. He just wanted to rush, had the cup of tea, said, sorry to disturb you, we'll have a proper catch-up next time. He said, no problem. Alex went out the door, and the man wanted to wait, A, because it had been snowing so heavily, and B, he wanted to make sure Alex didn't have any car trouble. So he just waited for the sound of the car driving off. No sound of a car. Sound of a siren, but no sound of a car. So he thought, well, what's going on? He must be having car trouble. Opens the door and there's no sign of Alex. There's no sign of Alex's car. In fact, there's no sign of Alex's footprints in the snow leading to or away from the house. He was baffled by this, went upstairs to tell his wife. His wife said, well, that's weird, I did hear you having a conversation together in the living room. So they both wrote out an account and sent it to Alex, knowing he was working in the ASPR. Funnily enough, though, that morning when Alex woke up, he believed he'd dreamt this entire experience or had a bilocation in his sleep. During that altered state, he'd visited his friend. So he wrote an account as well that was already written by the time the other accounts turned up. So Karlis Osis took these accounts, got affidavits signed, and this is just one of many instances of Alex having a bilocation. I mean, how fascinating is that? It's not just seeing the apparition. This guy was interacting with Alex, so much so that Alex was having a cup of tea. It was there to actually be drunk, finished off, the guy took it away to wash it up. It's remarkable in those instances. So Karlis Osis was fascinated with this. Besides the survival of death stuff, he thought, well, this is something in itself. If Alex can go out of body at will, surely this supports the notion of survival of death. If we can test it in the lab and show that while he's in one room, we can detect him in another room, that's showing evidence for the mind outside of the body. So they did this, and I think there's some pictures here. Here's some pictures of Alex working at the American Society for Psychical Research. I've got some of Karlis in there somewhere. It's not the kind of room that he was in at the time. This is just a machine that measured his heart rate and EEG as well. It was looking at his brainwave activity to see if he truly was entering an altered state while he was in there. There's a brilliant study published in 1980 in their journal. They did many over a 20-year period. To cut a long story short, what was happening was they had a few things to test if he truly was leaving one room and moving 4 rooms away, just with his mind in this Alex 2 state, this astral body. They had an optical illusion device. It's a box about this big, and the only way you could see inside was peering down inside this viewfinder. Inside was a spinning disc, and on this spinning disc you'd have 4 quadrants. You'd have upper left and upper right and lower left and lower right, 5 potential colours that would turn up on one of the quadrants, and about 4 or 5 different symbols as well. Alex's task while he was in one room on an intercom was to say, right, I'm in the room now, I'm peering through the viewfinder, and it's upper left, red, eye. And he'd have to do that over and over again. So he could get one of the quadrants right, he could get one of the colours right, and one of the symbols right. These studies showed that it was highly statistically significant what was going on when they added up all the 1s correct, all the 2s correct, and all 3 of them being correct. But what else did they have? That's just showing like clairvoyance, like I described to you earlier, seeing information at distance. That's not demonstrating something out of the body. So they had a strain gauge in there as well, which was showing that something indeed was in that room that didn't appear to be physically present. So they were baffled. These studies, though, they didn't get published beyond that point, and they kind of leave a lot of questions unanswered. But that was one thing they wanted to do, to demonstrate survival of death. The other thing was ghosts and hauntings. They thought we can go down this route of testing things in the lab, or we can go out into the field where people say they're seeing ghosts or they've got a haunted location. Why don't we actually go and test this? Alex, you've got these abilities. You can interact with the deceased. You have this as childhood experiences. And Karlis Osis was well skilled as a parapsychologist to take equipment along, interview eyewitnesses and so forth. This was an interesting thing that came about. Alex had published a book in 1976 called Beyond Coincidence, which was an autobiography of his life and included some instances of ghosts and hauntings. Then he did a book in 1979 called Is Your Child Psychic?, talking about all these imaginary friend instances and certain things children might do that suggest that they might have psychic abilities, and ways that you as a parent or an aunt or an uncle or grandparent can test and see, are children capable of getting things that adults can't? And so they thought this is a unique way forward. What we'll do is do these investigations through the American Society for Psychical Research, and we'll start to put them together. And what was going to happen was they were going to form a book called Conversations with Ghosts. And I was working with the Alex Tanous Foundation since 2011, I still am now, and they said, this is brilliant, do you want to start going through Alex's files and see what he's got? And I stumbled across a book that was only 3 chapters long, that outlined in a very much a documentary style, walk by walk, of what was going on in these locations from Alex's perspective. And I said, well, what happened here? Where are the other chapters? And they said, well, that was it really. And I thought, well, I've read so much unpublished. I've seen interviews with him on ghosts and what the afterlife actually is, and I've seen interviews with him about his opinion on poltergeists and stuff. Can't these be put together? And they said, well, sure, if you want to do that, do it. So that's how this came about. The original 3 chapters are in here, and there's an introduction to his life, and then chapters 4, 5 and 6 I've had to scramble together from notes and interviews, and then there's an appendices as well that also includes the Amityville haunting. How many of you with a nod of heads are familiar with Amityville? Some of you. From my perspective, and from what I saw Alex's perspective to be, it was complete nonsense. Alex was indeed the very first parapsychologist to go in there and investigate it. It was owned by the Lutz family that kind of started the whole media frenzy going, and they were responsible for keeping the whole royalties of the book alive and the film alive. And it was by the point that the family had moved out that Alex was actually called in to go and investigate Amityville with Dr Karlis Osis. So this was one of their many investigations that could have been a chapter. They got there and the Lutz family were living down the road, and they went to interview them, and another parapsychologist called Jerry Solvin turned up. So they thought, well, this is great, we can get Jerry to interview them while we sneak off to the house and go and look at it now it's empty. And they went round, there's nothing in there, no furniture, and so Karlis was doing his usual thing. He'd got an audio recorder, pen and pencil ready. Right, Alex, what are you getting? Who's here? What's haunting the place? What's happened before? Nothing. No. Nothing. Nothing's happened here, ever. Nothing at all. I'm not getting anything, it's not haunted. And Alex was surprised, but he was always honest like this. If he went to a place that someone claimed to be haunted, he would say something honestly, even if it contradicted the experiences. He'd say, well, I appreciate people experiencing this, but I'm getting this. And in this instance, very famous property, and he's saying, no, it's not haunted. They went back to the Lutz family, and as they were interviewing them, Alex was having a peruse around the kitchen and just doing the usual thing of listening in, and he caught more than a glimpse of a contract regarding the whole case of Amityville, and that the family were to keep the whole haunting alive and so forth, with all the royalties and that going from the book and the film. Funnily enough, at the time they turned up to investigate it, they noticed that maybe the family had indeed called a local news crew, because they were turning up in the carloads to suddenly come and interview these parapsychologists that were finally officially investigating Amityville. Karlis Osis quickly snuck off through the back door and went back to the ASPR and said, no, nothing's going on there. But it led to a lot of controversy. There were demonologists, Ed and Lorraine Warren, in the United States, that were very famous for Amityville, and they went on live radio after that and said, oh, we had official parapsychologists there. Alex Tanous went to investigate it, and he levitated through the entire house. Not only did he do that, he actually saw the devil in there as well. And this was said on live radio. Luckily, Alex had a lot of fans, and they said, oh, did you hear this radio show? They said that you levitated, which is remarkable. We've never seen you do that before. And you saw the devil as well. So he had to write some letters back to the radio show and say, right, take that back. You can't say that never happened. I want to read you a little bit of an extract, possibly from the Dandy House, just so you can see what the kind of way that Alex spoke about these cases, so you can see it's very much documentary style. There's a very short chapter regarding the Dandy House. Oh, by the way, there's a centerfold including all these pictures, so every time I've mentioned what people look like, you'll get a full view in there. Where is it? Come on. Dandy House, Dandy House. Hawk Mountain. I'm not going to find it in time, otherwise I'll be wasting time. As you can see, even though it's a little book, it's full of stuff, so I'm struggling to find it. But Alex would go in there. Some of the chapters are very much documentary style in the fact that it's all transcribed from the original tape, so there's no poetic license added into the whole investigations that were actually occurring. Why didn't this come about as a book? Well, Alex passed away in 1990. He'd originally been given a cancer warning in the late 70s, and he'd been involved in a lot of cases of psychic healing for people, and managed to shrink tumours or help people with broken arms suddenly heal faster than they were expected to. And he'd apparently done some self-healing, and the next time he went to the doctors they were shocked because there was no trace of the cancer anymore. In the late 80s, though, it came back. He'd had treatment for this, was given the all clear, but then subsequently died of a heart attack. And so he only actually saw 2 books completed in his lifetime, and that was Beyond Coincidence and Is Your Child Psychic? He also did a book called Dream Symbols and Psychic Power, which was the result of his teachings at the University of Southern Maine. He had a parapsychology class there, and he did dream interpretation classes. And from all these accounts people brought forward of why do I keep on dreaming of my teeth falling out, people would then say, well, in the waking state I'm having a lot of trouble at work, so there'd be associations between stressful situations and why you would be dreaming certain things. So to this day, Dream Symbols and Psychic Power is a book a lot of people like to keep by their bedside and think it's one of the best books produced by Alex Tanous, because they flip through and say, right, I was dreaming about horses, why was I dreaming about horses? And gives you an example of why we might dream about it, and then other people's examples as well. Alex spent so much of his time travelling the world. He'd done investigations in Egypt, he'd led psychic study groups around the Sphinx. He even was the one to unearth and discover that there was a hidden tomb behind the back of the Sphinx. Many people, many archaeologists would be adamant there isn't one, but I've got all the original notes and photographs of not only Alex talking about his visions of this space behind the back of the Sphinx, but when they actually first took out the stone and wanted Alex to be there, so he could be the first one to dip his head in and go and have a look. And funnily enough, there's a picture of him with his head down the hole taking photographs and so forth. So he was spending all of his time doing this, that he never released a book that's coming out later this year on his involvement with paranormal psychotherapy. He got enrolled by a psychiatrist and a psychologist to give an alternative approach to psychotherapy. So where you might go through a psychotherapy session and they might try and get to the root to why you've got a current day problem and how is the best course of counselling to be employed, and then what kind of medicine you might need, if any. They wanted Alex to take this role. Okay, you can do psychic readings for people, you're so good at this, let's see if it actually works, let's put it to the test. So instead of the psychotherapist or the psychiatrist actually counselling the person, getting to the root of it, you just tell us what the root is, and they're not going to interact with you. They're not going to tell you what happened, that as a child something happened, some accident or so forth, they were involved in a car crash and that trauma stuck with them and caused this mental scarring that's reoccurred in later life. He was just to say what was going on. So he'd come out with all this information, the patient was to say nothing, and then after he'd come out with all this information, they were to verify what was going on. And in the book Paranormal Psychotherapy, there's at least 9 or 10 accounts. Each individual chapter is a case study with these people. And you can see from the accounts that they go way beyond the cold reading or Barnum scripts and so forth. So you might get, well, when I say that, I mean in psychic readings you often get, okay, I'm reading you all now. Can anyone here relate to someone passing with a heart condition? Does that relate to anyone here? Anyone? No? Oh, at least one. Okay, so I can pick that out of a crowd. So it's going beyond that, something more specific. Remember I said about numbers and so forth. Alex was being very specific that it couldn't relate to other people. And that's why they were quite shocked within these sessions. He'd worked on research groups with the Bermuda Triangle. He'd studied people that claimed that they'd been abducted by UFOs. And these had all resulted in full manuscripts that I've got, and the Alex Tanous Foundation I've got, that just never came about as books. And so this is where Conversations with Ghosts came in. It was an unfinished book. It documented step by step these haunting investigations. Other chapters are his opinions as someone that studied psychology, philosophy and theology, and as a psychic what was going on. So that's probably pretty much all I can say about Conversations with Ghosts. I think you're going to get more out of this session by kind of asking me specific questions about the book or things to do with parapsychology. So at this point I'd open it up to questions. Yeah. Okay, so you mentioned what was going on in the case of Alex projecting and how he can physically touch things. Whether it was investigated further is a tricky question. It's like with all experiences of ghosts in general. As much as you'd like to ask further questions or see, well, go into that location and say, well, right, okay, where exactly was the ghost and where did it move to? That experience is gone for the person, which is the problem. Just like Alex's instance of drinking the cup of tea, all the gentleman had left after the experience was his memory and his account of it. Sure, he had the cup of tea, but he probably washed that up. He didn't think, what could you do with it? Box it up and send it to the ASPR. He wasn't thinking down that route. All that came out of it was an account from him, an account from his wife saying, I did hear the whole conversation, I heard him answer the door, so someone was definitely with my husband, and he says it was Alex. Those instances are so rare. I've heard of some accounts with G.N.M. Tyrrell. He wrote the book Apparitions, and he found that there was 4 or 5 different types of apparitions, and within that there were some remarkable accounts of people waking up at night, staying in old inns and castles and so forth, and sometimes waking up to see the apparition that had famously haunted the place.
An apparition is different.
Sure.
An apparition is somehow
But within this instance that I'm explaining, that someone actually reached out and managed to grab it. And so there are some instances of people seeing an apparition, being brave enough to step forward and see, well, does my hand go through it, or can I actually grab it? And there was this one great account, 2 sisters were staying in these beds. One woke up absolutely frightened, the other one was a bit more brave than the other one. She reached out, and it was a knight stood in armour, and she reached out, grabbed his arm, and she gave a full description of what it felt like. She said it was absolutely solid, it pulled away with tremendous force, she couldn't hold on to it. And even though she thought, well, someone's in the room, I've grabbed them here, I've caught them, sneaking into the room, the apparition moved backwards and just vanished through the door. So it's showing a semi-physical presence. There's a brilliant book called The Story of Ruth by Morton Chatsman, in which a lady was having apparitional experiences of someone that abused her once. And she was brought into London as a possible case of schizophrenia, and the psychiatrist said, no, let's not test her for schizophrenia, let's just say, you've seen ghosts, tell me about them. Made her more comfortable talking about these apparitions of her abuser, and the more comfortable she became, she eventually was able to project her apparitions at will. So much so that at some point some of the lab assistants could actually see these apparitions as well, suggesting again that it had a semi-physical presence. It wasn't just her and in her mind. Other people could see it occupying space. So there are these rare, unusual instances. Well, the definitions are kind of ghosts and apparitions. The definitions of ghosts and apparitions are quite interlinked. In parapsychology, we typically use the term apparition, but I also slip in ghosts as well. There is no real, in parapsychology, separate definition. Only in terms of, like I mentioned with Tyrrell, there are different categories of people seeing these apparitions. But that's only in terms of we might have apparitions that just repeat a particular thing and don't seem to show conscious awareness. We have apparitions that can see you and new things you put in the environment and might go around them. Ones that interact, and then other ones where not only are we seeing the apparition, we might enter a room and we're seeing the entire room as it once was, which might again incorporate apparitions of inanimate objects as well, so not just things that we knew once were living. So there are many kind of different levels as well. Certainly within parapsychology it's interchangeable, but I appreciate people use Alex was really free with his words when it came to different things. Poltergeists, he sometimes incorporated them with people that were trying to hunt demons. So again, like Ed and Lorraine Warren, he didn't believe in possession or anything like that. He thought it was all hocus pocus and a load of nonsense. But he was certainly in favour of poltergeists as well, just like ghosts and hauntings supporting survival of death. I don't think Alex spoke all that much of poltergeists on the side of being responsible by us. So poltergeist activity could be us. I mentioned psychokinesis, so it could be us just influencing things within our environment, and we've just interpreted it to be apparitions of the dead. Just spirits of the dead, because there's no apparition in that instance. But people might interpret it that way. The other instance could be that you're getting things in a location moving all the time, but it doesn't require anyone to be in that environment for things to move. You could leave a camera set up and things are still moving. So if we are blaming psychokinesis, who is responsible? So I think Alex was more on this side. He thought that independent spirits were responsible for the movement of objects within the environment. Certainly, if he discusses them at all, there's a chapter on his views of survival of death. I think it's about chapter 6, and you'll find them within there. There's also a very in-depth interview where he's talking about even ethnicity and ghosts, where a lot of people were describing that they'd only seen certain types of ghosts worldwide, and he was saying, well, they're actually varied. It doesn't matter where you're from, ghosts have appeared in all different regions. So the kind of discussions you don't regularly get in many ghost books, where they're just talking about go to Beckett's castle and you'll see this, that and the other. He's talking about, well, the characteristics and the personality that come out of ghosts seem to vary as well. These are really varied topics, and there's so much material to dig through, and there are some places where Alex's material on apparitions and ghosts we just can't get to, like in the ASPR and other places like that. There's more material to be unearthed. So this book, one day, could potentially be slightly bigger if I could get hold of just this one box I know about, which has got some extra interviews and articles that are just long since forgotten. And this is the terrible thing, you know, if I could have met him, if our time paths had overlapped, I would have interviewed him on stuff like that and really got to the nitty-gritty of some questions I wanted to ask him, especially on some of the stuff you've raised. You are going to love the chapter in there called Continuing Bonds and the Spiralling Effect. And Alex was a strong believer that if you lived in a house all your life and you died there, then you would be stuck within this environment to an extent. It'd be very confusing, this transfer of consciousness into a disembodied state. And he mentioned, it was kind of a very romantic chapter, because he said you get a couple that live there and one would promise the other, if I die, I will wait for you. And he said he went to a few locations where he went in, a couple lived there, one had died, and then 5 years later the other person died. But they were on slightly different time levels within the building, so they never got to see each other. And he said it's this spiralling effect. The longer you spend in spirit, the harder it is to communicate with all those other people that passed over. So he said when he went in, he tried to act as a psychic counsellor. And he mentions that quite a lot. He mentions psychic counselling. He always referred to himself as a ghost counsellor as well. He said when he went into a location, he wouldn't walk around with the pen and pencil and tape recorder all the time. Sometimes he'd just sit there and have a think. And people would say, well, what are you doing? And he said, well, I'm counselling the ghosts because they can't see each other and they want to leave. And, you know, visually, if we were to go in, we probably wouldn't have found that very interesting because it's all in Alex's head. We needed him to talk about it to really get the really kind of juicy material out of there. So he did. He said, I'd reunite them through this counselling aspect. I'd say, you're here, you're lost. Look, I'm bringing you closer together. Can you see each other now? And he'd say he'd reunite them, and at that point they were reunited. He'd let them go. What happened after that? Again, these are one of the many questions we want to ask. Were those people that lived there presently, did they then experience things after that where Alex went in and joined them together? Was there more activity, or were they genuinely gone after that? Had he released them into what some might call the light, or on after that? We don't know, but he talks forever about this spiralling effect and joining people together and seeing if they can meet. But he was a strong believer in residual energy in buildings. He'd go in and just go, whoa, you know, all kinds of things happening here on many, many different levels. There's a lot of documentary style stuff in there describing that, where he walks you through step by step as the reader and says, it was so traumatic, it brought tears to my eyes. He'd really feel the emotions coming in, whether it be some sort of violent incident or some really sad tragedy going on. It's a pretty dramatic for yes. Oh, absolutely. There was an interesting paper in the Australian Journal of Parapsychology a couple of years ago with a doctor of psychology from Brazil, and they published a paper on counselling the deceased for post-traumatic stress disorder. Really unique paper because it couldn't be peer-reviewed by its very natures. It couldn't go through that process because here's someone claiming that they're counselling the deceased. The only way they could make it scientific was say, these are my accounts of counselling the dead, just like Alex was doing. I'm going to use Cartesian skepticism, which basically means I'm going to be really critical of my own experiences. And they did. They were critical of every single account, and it created a big open dialogue. So we do know of people doing this. They're not going in and wanting to make this big hoo-ha about an investigation. They want to counsel people that they are adamant have passed over. So we do get this in the literature now, and that's remarkable when you hear these accounts. So hopefully that chapter will really interest you, and you can draw some links between your own experiences and that. And if you do, I'd love to hear more about your own experiences. Just to these experiences, you get the suggestion from his mentions of the spiralling effect and these continued bonds in the afterlife, that once he joined these people together, that they were moving on. And there could be all these terms that you've just mentioned, and entering the light and so forth. Again, if I could trawl through this extra box of material and his opinions on counselling the discarnate, then maybe he'd give specific terminology for it. But certainly the ideas that you've mentioned are very much linked with his ideas as well. I think he believed that there could be a point where you could just move on and no one within that environment would experience haunting type phenomena again. I mean, I'm very much middle ground because I'm coming at this as a psychologist. I'm very sceptical, but I admit that people had these experiences. I can't deny the fact that people say they've seen ghosts or had psychic experiences, but these experiences are also documented as well. I'm very much interested in his perspective of what he's seeing and what he's doing as a psychologist and parapsychologist. It fascinates me, and there could be something to it when people are having all this haunting phenomena. He goes in and counsels them and lets them see the light, and then afterwards people in that environment aren't encountering anything anymore. You could argue that because they saw him do this, that it's placebo, and therefore all the activity they associated with haunting, they're now glancing over and it's not registering. But if they didn't know he'd done that, and they go in and nothing's happening anymore, that's interesting, because then where's the influence? There's so many different avenues you could go in. I guess that's brought us to time. Once again, I really hope that was interesting. A lot of people say when as I say, if you do a topic on one particular individual, is it going to really interest people? Because my own PhD has been on bereavement experiences and how helpful having a paranormal experience in bereavement is compared to people that don't. And this is really broad. 50 to 60% of the population have these experiences. Why do we have them? What's the actual nature of these experiences? Is it you creating them, or is it something independent? So perhaps that's something later on with Watkins I could come back and talk about. I've even studied specifically instances of telephone calls from the dead. And that, again, has been a big topic of interest. So hopefully I'll be back sometime. But thank you so much for coming to listen to this talk on Alex Tanous and Conversations with Ghosts. Thank you.